April 29, 1945. The forested hills south of Munich, Germany. The air smells of wet pine and cordite. A cold spring mist clings to the Bavarian earth, muffling the world in a shroud of grey. For 15-year-old Flakhelfer Klaus Richter, the world has shrunk to the muddy scrape of a foxhole and the weight of the Panzerfaust 60 resting against his shoulder. His uniform, a cobbled-together assembly of a Luftwaffe jacket too large and Hitlerjugend trousers too short, is soaked through. The tremor in his hands has nothing to do with the cold. It is the deep, resonant vibration of an enemy he cannot yet see. The ground itself is humming a funeral dirge. You can feel it in your teeth. The low growl of engines, multiplied by dozens. American tanks. Shermans. The beasts from the propaganda newsreels made real. Klaus risks a glance over the lip of his foxhole. Beside him, huddled in a similar hole, is Emil, barely 14, his face a pale oval of terror under a steel helmet that wobbles with every shiver. They are two of 30 boys and old men, the last dregs of the Reich's fighting power, the Volkssturm. Their commander is a man with one arm and the haunted eyes of Stalingrad, a Wehrmachtfeldwebel named Schmidt, who barks orders that are lost in the rising cacophony. Their mission is simple. Hold this road. A road to nowhere, it seems, but a road that must be held. For the Führer. For the fatherland. The words are hollow now, echoes from a sunnier time of parades and banners. Here, in the mud, there is only the gnawing fear and the iron stink of approaching death. Feldwebel Schmidt crawls along the line, his face streaked with grime. He slaps Klaus's helmet, a gesture meant to be reassuring but feels like a physical blow. Wait for the emblem, boy, he rasps, his voice a dry crackle. The white star. See the star, then fire. Aim for the tracks or the space just below the turret. Make it count. Klaus nods, his throat too tight to speak. He has practiced with the Panzerfaust only once, on a wooden silhouette. It had felt powerful then, a dragon's breath he could command. Now, it feels alien, a heavy tube of metal promising only noise and violence. The rumbling intensifies. It is no longer just a sound, it is a physical pressure, crushing the air from his lungs. Trees at the bend in the road begin to tremble, then sway, then splinter. The first M4 Sherman tank lurches into view. It is a monster of olive drab steel, mud-caked and immense, its long 76mm gun traversing slowly, sniffing the air for threats. The white star on its hull is like a malevolent eye. Klaus's mind goes blank. All the training, all the shouted slogans about Germanic courage, evaporate into a single, primal urge, to disappear. To become one with the mud. But Emil whimpers beside him, a tiny, animal sound of pure dread. The sound snaps something in Klaus. He is the older one. He is the Rottenführer. He shoves his fear down, deep into the pit of his stomach, and rests the Panzerfaust's crude sight on his shoulder. He remembers Schmidt's words. Wait for the star. Aim for the tracks. The tank grinds closer, its treads chewing up the soft earth, spitting dirt and stones. 50 meters. 40. The chattering of its coaxial machine gun erupts, a burst of sound that rips the air apart, shredding the leaves on the trees above his head. He can hear men screaming somewhere down the line. He squeezes his eyes shut for a second, a boy's prayer to a god he no longer believes in. Then he opens them. He puts the sight on the Sherman's bogies. His world narrows to that single point. He thumbs the firing trigger. The world erupts in a flash of white-hot fury. The backblast kicks a storm of dirt and debris into his face, and the rocket streaks away with a deafening hiss. For a heartbeat, there is only the roar in his ears. Then, a clang of metal on metal. He has hit it. Smoke billows from the tank's tracks. It slows sideways, crippled but not dead. Its turret begins to turn, a slow, deliberate movement of pure menace. It is turning towards him. The Sherman's main gun fired. The sound was not a bang or a boom, it was a physical concussion that lifted Klaus from his foxhole and threw him backward into the dark soil. The world dissolved into a screaming vortex of pressure and roaring noise. Earth rained down on him, filling his mouth, his eyes, his ears. He lay there, stunned, his senses obliterated. The smell of high explosives was thick and acrid, burning his nostrils. He was deaf and, the world reduced to a high-pitched whine. Consciousness returned in fragments, shards of a broken mirror reflecting a scene from hell. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard new sounds. Shouts in a language he didn't understand. The sharp, metallic crack of different rifles' M1 Garands. He pushed himself up on trembling elbows. The German line had collapsed. Gray-clad figures were stumbling out of the trees, hands raised high. Feldwebel Schmidt lay nearby, his one good arm twisted at an impossible angle, his face a mask of serene stillness. The battle, which had seemed like an eternity, had lasted less than 10 minutes. A shadow fell over him. Klaus looked up into the face of an American soldier. He was huge, framed by the gray sky, a helmet casting his face in shadow. In his hands, he held a rifle, its bayonet fixed. This was it. The moment the propaganda had warned them about. The brutal, soulless American gangster, here to finish him off. Klaus squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the blade or the bullet. He thought of his mother, her face at the train station as he left, trying so hard not to cry. Instead of pain, he felt a hand grab the collar of his jacket and haul him to his feet. He swayed, his head spinning. The soldier was saying something, his voice urgent but not angry. Klaus couldn't understand the words. The soldier gestured with his rifle toward the road. Go. Move. Klaus stumbled forward, joining a small, shuffling group of survivors. He saw Emil, his face streaked with tears and dirt, his hands clasped on top of his wobbly helmet. Their eyes met for a second, a shared moment of utter, bottomless despair. They were prisoners. They were marched to the road, where more Americans from the 45th Infantry Division were disarming the other Volkssturm. The GIs moved with a weary efficiency. They were not the monsters from the newsreels. They were young men, most not much older than Klaus, their faces etched with the same fatigue he felt. One of them, a corporal with kind eyes, saw the boys trembling and nudged his companion. He pulled a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes from his helmet band, shook one out, and offered it to the oldest-looking prisoner, a man of 60 with a magnificent white mustache. The old man stared at the cigarette as if it were a snake before slowly, tentatively taking it. The small acts of humanity were more disorienting than brutality would have been. Another GI offered Emil a piece of a chocolate bar. Emil recoiled at first, then, seeing no threat, snatched it and shoved it into his pocket, as if expecting it to be taken away. They were herded onto the back of a large, canvas-topped truck, a GMC CKW. The engine rumbled to life, and as it pulled away, Klaus looked back at the forest. It was a place where he had ceased to be a boy. He didn't know what he was now. The truck smelled of gasoline and unwashed bodies. They drove for what felt like hours, deeper into enemy-held territory, the German landscape he had been ordered to die for scrolling past like a dream. They arrived at a makeshift collection point in a muddy field next to a bombed-out farmhouse. More prisoners were gathered there, hundreds of them, a sea of gray uniforms and defeated faces. An American officer, a captain with an intelligence insignia on his collar, was interrogating new arrivals. When he saw Klaus's small group being prodded off the truck, he paused and walked over. He looked them up and down, his gaze lingering on their Hitler-jugend patches and their terrified, childish faces. His own face was a mixture of pity and disbelief. He spoke, and the sound of it sent a shock through Klaus. It was perfect, unaccented German. "We outside here. How old are you?" No one answered. They stared at him, their indoctrination warring with their fear. They were to give only name, rank, and serial number. But what rank did a child hold in a lost war? The officer's expression softened. "It's all right," he said, his voice quiet. "The war is over for you." The words didn't register as a relief. They felt like a verdict. The journey into the unknown began. From the muddy field in Bavaria, Klaus and the other boys were moved by truck and train to a massive transit camp near Reims, in France. Here, the sheer scale of the Allied war machine was laid bare. It was a city of tents and barbed wire, teeming with thousands of German prisoners from every front. Klaus saw grizzled veterans of the Afrika Korps, stoic SS Panzer Grenadiers with their chilling death's head insignia, and bewildered Luftwaffe ground crew, all reduced to the same status, disarmed, defeated, and anonymous. They were processed with an impersonal, assembly line efficiency. Their worn uniforms were taken and incinerated. They were pushed through delousing stations, sprayed with a fine, acrid DDT powder that clung to their skin and hair for days. They were issued new clothing, simple work shirts and trousers made of coarse, dark blue denim. On the back of the shirt and down the leg of the pants were two large white letters painted in stark, bold strokes, PW. Prisoner of war. The brand marked them, stripped them of their former identity. They were no longer Hitler's youth, they were property of the United States Army. The next stage of the journey was the sea. They were marched up the gangplank of a Liberty ship in the vast, rebuilt harbor of Cherbourg. The ship was a gray, functional vessel, devoid of any comfort, its decks crowded with American GIs heading home on rotation. The prisoners were herded down into the cavernous holds, vast metal chambers where bunks were stacked 4 or 5 high. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, disinfectant, and salt. For 2 weeks, this steel belly was their world. The Atlantic was a vast, gray emptiness. Day after day, the view from the small, high portholes was the same, an endless expanse of churning water and sky. The boys kept to themselves, a small, tight knot of fear and suspicion amidst the older, more cynical prisoners. They spoke in whispers, repeating the last, desperate warnings from their leaders. The Americans were taking them to Siberia to be worked to death. They were going to be used for medical experiments. They were being taken to America to be sterilized, to end the German race. The rumors fed their terror. They watched the American guards who brought their meals, looking for any sign of the cruelty they had been promised. But the guards were mostly bored kids from places like Ohio and Texas. They performed their duties with a detached professionalism, occasionally trying to trade cigarettes for a German medal or belt buckle. Then, one morning, a new energy pulsed through the ship. A cry went up. Land. Klaus scrambled to a porthole, jostling for a view. Through the haze, he saw it. A low, green coastline that stretched on forever. And then, the buildings. Towers of glass and steel that pierced the clouds, grander and more numerous than anything he had ever seen in Berlin or Munich. There was no rubble. No bombed-out husks of buildings. No columns of smoke on the horizon. It was whole. It was undamaged. It was powerful. The port of Newport News, Virginia. This single view did more to dismantle years of Goebbels propaganda than any lecture ever could. The stories of a decadent, collapsing America, bled dry by the war, were lies. The realization was a cold stone in his stomach. They had not been fighting a dying empire. They had been fighting this. On solid ground, the disorientation grew. They were marched onto a train, a long silver centipede of passenger cars. The windows were covered with black blinds, but through the gaps, Klaus caught glimpses of a world that defied belief. Paved roads crowded with colorful automobiles. Houses with green, manicured lawns. People walking freely, their clothes bright, their faces showing no sign of fear or deprivation. The train began to move, its whistle a mournful cry in the night. It clicked and swayed, carrying them deeper and deeper into the vast, unknowable heart of the enemy continent. Each mile was a step further away from everything they had ever known. The fear was no longer a sharp spike, but a dull, constant ache. They were cargo, being shipped to a final, terrifying destination. The train journey lasted for 3 days. 3 days of darkness, punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track and the muffled sounds of a world they could not see. They crossed rivers, plains, and what felt like an entire continent. The guards gave them food in cardboard boxes, sandwiches with thick slices of meat, apples, and milk in small cartons. It was more than Klaus had seen in a month. But the food could not quiet the fear. The train finally slowed, the squeal of its brakes a long, agonizing sound that scraped at their nerves. It hissed to a stop. The doors were pulled open, and the light that flooded the car was blinding. It was a harsh, white light, reflecting off a vast, flat landscape that stretched to a horizon of infinite blue sky. They were in Kansas. Camp Concordia. They were herded off the train and onto a dusty platform. In front of them, behind a high fence topped with coils of barbed wire, lay the camp. It looked exactly as they had imagined. Long, black, tar paper barracks laid out in a precise, unforgiving grid. Guard towers stood at each corner, stark silhouettes against the immense sky. It was a prison. Their worst fears were realized. An American captain stood waiting for them. He was tall, with a stern face, but his uniform was immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine. An interpreter stood beside him, a younger sergeant with glasses. The captain spoke, his words crisp and clear in the dry air. The sergeant translated. "You are now at prisoner of war Camp Concordia. You will follow the rules. You will work when assigned. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Any attempt to escape will be met with force. Move out." The gate swung open. They were ordered to form a single file line. Klaus found himself near the front, just behind a boy from his unit named Hans. Emil was a few places behind him, his small frame almost swallowed by the PW uniform. They began to walk. It was the longest walk of Klaus's life. Down a wide gravel road that cut through the center of the camp. Their boots crunched in the unnatural quiet. On either side, older German prisoners stopped what they were doing to watch the new arrivals. Hundreds of eyes followed their procession. Weather-beaten faces from the Wehrmacht, pale faces of U-boat crews, hard faces of the Waffen-SS. They stared at the column of boys, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, pity, and contempt. Klaus kept his eyes fixed on the gravel in front of him. He focused on the discipline that had been drilled into him since he was 10 years old. Back straight. Chin down. Arms stiff. Do not draw attention. Do not make a mistake. A mistake could mean a beating. A mistake could mean being singled out. A mistake, his Hitlerjugend leader had screamed at them just months ago, was a betrayal of the Führer, and betrayal was punishable by death. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in his chest, making it hard to breathe. The sun was hot on his neck. A fly buzzed near his ear. He could hear Emil's breathing behind him, a series of shallow, terrified gasps. The silence was absolute, broken only by their footsteps. It felt like a tribunal. They were walking towards their judgment. Every fiber of their being screamed that this was a trap. The quiet was a lie. The orderliness was a prelude to some unimagined horror. They passed a barracks, and for a moment, Klaus looked up. He saw the face of an older prisoner, a man with a gray beard, watching them from a window. The man was not scowling. He wasn't sneering. He was just watching. And on his face was an expression of profound sadness. Ahead of them, Emil stumbled. His ankle turned on a loose piece of gravel, and he pitched forward, catching himself with his hands before he could fall. He froze, his entire body rigid with terror. He had made a mistake. He had broken the silent, solemn procession. He slowly pushed himself upright, his face white as a sheet, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at Klaus, then past him, at the tall American captain who had stopped and turned to look back at the commotion. The silence was no longer empty, it was heavy, suffocating. Emil's lips trembled. A small, thin voice, fragile as glass, broke the stillness. He wasn't speaking to the captain as a commander. He was speaking as a child to an adult, a plea for clarification on the rules of a terrifying new game. The interpreter's brow furrowed as he listened to the boys whisper German. He turned to the captain. But the question, even in a foreign tongue, hung in the air, filled with the weight of years of terror. "Sir," the interpreter said, his voice low. "The boy is asking, he wants to know if they are allowed to smile." The captain did not move for a long moment. He simply stood on the gravel road under the vast Kansas sky, looking at the small, trembling boy in the oversized prison uniform. The question seemed to hang in the air, an impossible artifact from another world. The other American guards shifted uncomfortably. The German prisoners watching from the barracks fences grew still, straining to hear. The captain's stern expression softened, the hard lines around his mouth giving way to something else, a deep, profound weariness, the look of a man who had seen too much of what the world could do to its children. He walked back toward Emil, his polished boots crunching softly on the gravel. He did not loom over him. Instead, he crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Emil flinched, expecting a blow. The captain ignored the interpreter. He looked directly at Emil, and though he spoke in English, his tone transcended language. It was gentle. "What's your name, son?" The interpreter quickly translated. Fragt nach deinem Namen." "Emil," the boy whispered, his eyes still fixed on the ground. The captain reached out, not to strike, but to gently lift Emil's chin with his finger, forcing the boy to look at him. "Listen to me, Emil," he said slowly, his voice calm and steady. The interpreter's German followed a half-second behind. "The war is over. You are not a soldier anymore. You're a boy. Here, yes. You are allowed to smile. You can laugh. You can do anything you want, as long as you follow the rules and don't cause trouble." He gave a small, sad smile of his own. "We'd prefer it, actually." The words struck the group of boys with the force of a physical blow. It was an answer so completely outside their frame of reference that, for a moment, it didn't compute. Permission. Not an order, not a threat, not a rule to be obeyed under penalty of pain, but a simple, human permission. Klaus stared at the American officer, at this man who was supposed to be his mortal enemy, who was now giving a child leave to feel joy. It was the most powerful and disarming weapon he had ever encountered. It was an act of humanity so profound it shattered the foundations of his world. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on Emil's cheek. Then, a strange, convulsive twitch happened at the corner of his mouth. It was a hesitant, unfamiliar movement, the ghost of a muscle trying to remember a long-forgotten function. It was a smile. Watery, fragile, and heartbreakingly uncertain, but it was a smile. Seeing it, another boy nearby let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Klaus felt his own face contoured, a stinging in his eyes and a strange lightness in his chest. He looked at his comrades, and for the first time in years, he truly saw them not as a squad of soldiers, but as what they were, scared children. That moment was the beginning of the thaw. Life in Camp Concordia was nothing like the propaganda had foretold. They were given clean barracks, 3 meals a day, and medical care. They worked, tending fields or fixing equipment, but the labor was not brutal. In the evenings, they were not left to fester in their ideology. They were required to attend classes. The teachers were often German-speaking American academics, some of whom were Jewish refugees who had fled the very regime these boys had been fighting for. They began a new kind of education. They were shown films, not of German triumphs, but of the Allied armies liberating Buchenwald and Dachau. They saw the skeletal figures, the piles of bodies, the ovens. They were confronted with the unvarnished, monstrous truth of the system they had sworn to die for. For many, the denial was instantaneous. Lies. American propaganda. But the images were undeniable, and the quiet, factual testimony of their instructors slowly eroded the wall of indoctrination. They were given books that had been burned in Germany, works by Mann, Zweig, and Remarque. They learned of a Germany they had never been allowed to know. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the boys began to change. The rigid discipline slackened. They started a soccer league in the dusty yard between the barracks. The sound of shouting and laughter, raw and genuine, began to fill the air. An American guard taught them the rules of baseball, and soon the crack of a bat became as common as the call of a meadowlark. They learned English words, traded with the guards, and began to dream of a future that did not involve a battlefield. The barbed wire fences were still there, a constant reminder of their status. But they no longer felt just like a cage keeping them in. They were also a sanctuary, keeping the war, and the men who had stolen their childhoods, out. Months later, Klaus stood in the midfield of a frantic soccer game. The Kansas sun was warm on his face. The ball came to him. He controlled it, sidestepped a defender, and passed it to Emil, who kicked it clumsily but joyfully toward the makeshift goal. And Klaus laughed. It was not a smirk or a nervous twitch. It was a deep, genuine, unrestrained laugh, a sound rising from a part of him he thought had died in the mud of Bavaria. The war was over. And here, thousands of miles from the ruins of his homeland, he was finally, truly, allowed to be a child again.